Okay, we finished up our last discussion talking about the elasticity of demand. And we know that elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price, measuring how responsive the consumer is to a price change. We know that when we get the elasticity of demand and we get our answer, if the elasticity of demand is greater than 1, then it is elastic. If elasticity of demand is less than 1, it is inelastic. And that if the elasticity of demand is equal to 1, then it is unit elastic. Now, it's important to understand that it doesn't matter the signs here, right? Signs don't matter because it will always be negative, right? Because they move in opposite directions. Because it will always be negative here. So let's talk about the reasons, what makes this. And there's actually 4 reasons, right? Or determinants is what the book uses. Determinants of elasticity. What makes it more elastic or less elastic? Of elasticity. Let's see if I can spell. And I'm going to see if I can move this away a little bit. I can. All right. So what makes it more elastic or less elastic? So when I'm looking at this, it's important to understand that the first thing is going to be the availability of substitutes. So the more substitutes we have, right, the more elastic it's going to be. More subs, more elastic. So if you only have one place to eat for lunch, right, you're going to pay whatever it costs to eat lunch there. However, if you have 10 different places to pick for lunch, then you're going to be more responsive. So that if one lowers its price, you're much more likely to go there than other places. So the availability of substitutes is 1. The second is whether it's a luxury or necessity. Necessity. Now, if it's a luxury, it's going to be elastic. If it is a necessity, it's going to be inelastic, which means we're not going to be responsive. Reasons why are like this. A vacation is something I don't have to do. So if the price of a vacation goes up, I'm going to be less responsive to it. However, my pharmaceuticals, right, like my insulin, if I had diabetes, is a necessity. I have to have it. So therefore, it would be very inelastic. I could not respond to a price change. I would always buy the same thing. All right, the third is going to be the amount of time that we have. So the more time you have, the more elastic. Because you can search for those substitutes, right? The more time that I have, the more elastic my demand is going to be because I can search for the substitutes out there. If I'm going to see my sick mother, I have very inelastic demand. I'll pay the $800 it takes to get to her home. If, however, I am going to go on vacation, right, and I have 8 months to search, then I'm going to have a lot more time to make those decisions. The last one is going to be the amount of the budget. So the greater the percentage of the budget, right, the greater the percentage is more elastic. So it just says like the more money you spend, the more you'll search for a substitute for something cheaper out there. So we start talking about determinants. That's what we're referring to. What makes something more elastic or inelastic? All right. For elasticity demand, let's use one other thing, okay? Let's talk about elasticity demand as it refers to how elasticity of demand and total revenue are connected. So elasticity of demand and total revenue. So I'm going to draw just 2 small graphs. And this is going to be a straight line demand curve, right? And right in the middle is where demand is unit elastic. On any straight line demand curve, there's points of unit elasticity. The upper portion is always going to be elastic. And then the lower portion is always going to be inelastic demand if you have a straight line demand curve. Now what I want to show you is how this relates, because remember this is quantity and this is quantity. So if our quantities are remaining the same, this is going to be price, but this curve is going to show the total revenue. So that at this point of unit elasticity, whatever that quantity is, that's when our total revenue is maxed, right? Now remember, it's elastic demand here. So we want to move to the middle because we want to move to here to maximize that total utility, which happens at unelasticity. So in order to do so, we had to do what to price? Price had to come down to move us toward there. So if you have elastic demand, then you have to decrease price to increase your total revenue. But on this side, you have inelastic demand, and to move toward the middle, what has to happen to price? Price has to go up, right? So, because we want to move to the middle, we want to get to the peak of total revenue. So if you have inelastic demand, right, inelastic demand, you want to increase the price to increase total revenue. A really easy way to remember it is in, and in, right? So that's how those two things are connected. All right, there are the curves for elasticity. It's important to understand kind of what they look like. So again, we're going to be drawing demand curves because elasticity of demand. So two axes, ceteris paribus, we're holding everything else constant. And price is going to go on the vertical. Quantity is going to go on the horizontal. And if you have a curve that looks like this demand curve, that almost makes an E, doesn't it? So we call this perfectly elastic demand. Now, the reason why that's perfectly elastic is that if the price stays within 1%, then the quantity that we demand will go to infinity. So if we calculate the elasticity demand, it would be the quantity would go to infinity, the denominator would stay 1% or less, so therefore the elasticity of demand is equal to infinity. All right? Now, the other extreme circumstance that we have for this elasticity is a curve that looks like this. This demand curve almost looks like an I, doesn't it? So we call this perfectly inelastic demand. Now here, the elasticity of demand, the quantity cannot change at all. It is locked in, let's say at 10. It cannot move at all. So that percentage change in the denominator is going to be 0 because the quantity cannot change. However, the price would go all the way to infinity. We'd pay whatever we need to. So therefore, the elasticity of demand would equal to 0. Now the last is going to be what we've been measuring all day long, and it's somewhere in the middle, right? So that if we look, we would measure a percentage change in price. Let's just say it's 10% here, to a percentage change in quantity demanded. Let's say that's 20%. And then here, we would look at the elasticity of demand equals percentage change in quantity demanded, which is 20, over 10, which would give us 2, and that would be elastic. So the more vertical a curve is, so we could also look at a curve like this, right? So that if we look at the differences between the two, the percentage change here in price might be 30 to 10%, which would give us elasticity demand of 1/3 or 0.33, and that would be very inelastic. So if we look across, perfectly vertical going across, horizontal, not vertical, is perfectly elastic. Perfectly horizontal, I'm going to get this right eventually. Perfectly vertical, making an I, would be perfectly inelastic. It can't move. It's locked on. And then we measure what the percentage change in. But the more steep the curve is, the more inelastic. The flatter the curve, the more elastic. All right. Now that's all we talked about with elasticity demand. The same formulas would actually work for elasticity of supply, right? Elasticity of supply equals the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. And we measure it the exact same way. We're going to use new minus old over the average for both, right? Times 100. So it doesn't matter any time that we look at percentage change, we're looking at new minus the old over the average, and then put it in percent, and that would be 100. All right? So elasticity of supply. This tells us whether that supply curve is steep or flat and whatever's happening there. If the elasticity of supply is greater than 1, it's elastic, which is the same as elasticity of demand. If the elasticity of supply is less than 1, it's inelastic. If the elasticity of supply is equal to 1, it's unit elastic. So again, we're measuring how responsive sellers are to a price change. The flatter the curve, the more elastic they're going to be, right? And remember this curve, when you look at elasticity, this would be a perfectly inelastic supply curve, right? Perfectly inelastic supply. I shouldn't have put perfectly inelastic. This would be a perfectly elastic supply curve. Remember, supply curve is going to be upward sloping. That's pretty steep, so that's going to be inelastic. And then the flatter the curve is, the more elastic that curve is going to be. All right, let's look at our last two ways that we look at elasticity. First is going to be cross elasticity. And for cross elasticity, what we're measuring is the responsiveness of the change in quantity demanded of one good to the price change of another. So we're going to look at it the same way. E sub C equals the percentage change in quantity demanded, and I'm just going to put good A all over the percentage change in price of good B. So when we get this answer, we are now, signs are going to matter. Signs matter. Because if they move in the same direction, then it would be substitutes. If both of them are going up, then we have a positive answer. And that answer would tell me that these goods are substitutes. If we get a negative answer, then that tells me that these goods are complements. If we get an answer that's equal to 0, right? Equal to 0, there is no relationship. So if you get an E sub C of 8.2, those are pretty significant substitutes. If you get an E sub C of 0.8, they're still substitutes, just not quite as strong. The higher the number, the higher the relationship between the two. But again, 0 means no relationship. All right, the last type of elasticity that we talk about in this chapter is going to be income elasticity. Now, when we talk about income elasticity, it's important here we're measuring the percentage change in quantity demanded to an income change. So as your income changes, I can tell you one thing you're pretty much elastic that you have that's a normal good for you would be eating out. Most people, if they start getting a higher income, they eat out more times during the month. So here, I'm going to use the E sub Y. You might see E sub I. You might see all kinds of different abbreviations, but Y is the one that I use most frequently. You're going to have percentage change in quantity demanded over that percentage change in income. So if this answer, and again, signs are going to matter, so signs matter, just for these last two. So if you get an answer that is positive, what do you think that tells you? It tells you that this is a normal good. Now remember, a normal good is one that if your income goes up, you purchase more of. So that has to be true, right? Up and up, they're moving the same direction. But if my income drops, I don't have as many goods there that I'm purchasing. An example here would be like filet mignon, shrimp, lobster, eating out, dry cleaning. All of those would be normal goods on services that we use out there. Now, negative is going to be an inferior good. If I have an inferior good, that means as my income goes up, I never want to have it again. For me, an inferior good is Chef Boyardee SpaghettiOs. When I was in college, they were like 8 cans for $1. And so we lived off of them because they were so cheap. I think I ate SpaghettiOs every day of my sophomore year. And I swore if my income ever went up, I never want to see a SpaghettiO again. But if my income goes down, I might have to have these again. Another example might be ramen noodles, Spam, generic products, Dr. Thunder, right, instead of Dr. Pepper, Mountain Lightning, right, all those kind of good products out there. And then if this ends up equaling to 0, you have a neutral good. And neutral goods are those goods that you would buy no matter what your income's doing. So your toilet paper, probably your toothpaste, probably all those things would be similar. This completes this chapter. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know, and I'll be happy to help you anytime that I can, any way that I can. Have a great week.